You go to the grocery store to buy a dozen eggs. The price has jumped again. You assume the supermarket is simply price gouging you to aggressively maximize their corporate quarterly profits. It feels deeply unfair. But what if the truth is much bigger than your local grocery aisle? What if that price hike is the silent cost of a crumbling empire? You swipe your credit card anyway. For 99% of modern consumers, this friction-free spending is a carefully engineered psychological trap. You are spending a melting currency. Have you ever wondered why the green paper in your wallet has any actual value? The global economy is heavily manipulated. It runs on a massive subsidy. For roughly the last 50 years, the entire international financial system has been propped up by the absolute dominance of the United States dollar. That subsidy is now severely cracking. Do you know how your money got this immense, unquestioned power in the first place? To understand your own bank account, you must understand a concept called reserve currency status. A reserve currency is the baseline. It is simply the money that the rest of the world voluntarily holds in its massive savings account to facilitate cross-border international trade. It is the global financial bedrock. What happens when that exact bedrock begins to severely fracture under immense global pressure? Let us rewind to the aftermath of the Second World War. The world was in absolute ruins. Delegates from allied nations gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to forge a brand new international monetary agreement. The United States held the massive leverage. Did you know they practically controlled the vast majority of the global gold supply at that exact time? The world agreed to peg their native currencies directly against the powerful dollar. The dollar was heavily protected. It was explicitly and legally backed by physical gold, at a fixed international rate of exactly $35 an ounce. It was literally as good as gold. But what happens when a powerful government slowly realizes it can print infinite paper to fund its massive political promises? Human greed always finds a way to slowly bend the established rules. The United States began running massive deficits. They confidently printed far more paper dollars to fund endless wars and expensive domestic programs than they actually had in gold sitting safely inside their vaults. Other nations eventually noticed this mathematical impossibility. How long can a traditional bank survive when everyone demands their physical deposits back at the exact same time? The world began to aggressively demand their physical gold back. They rejected the paper illusion. In 1960, a brilliant Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin stood before Congress and bravely predicted a devastating, unavoidable financial disaster. He introduced the famous Triffin dilemma. Are you starting to clearly see the invisible, mathematical trap closing tightly around your personal wealth? This dilemma is a terrifying economic paradox. It dictates a brutal, undeniable reality. It states that the country issuing the global reserve currency must intentionally run massive trade deficits to actively supply the rest of the world with enough money to function. The system requires constant, accelerating debt expansion. What happens if the dominant global power decides to suddenly stop printing that essential money? If they stop printing dollars, the global economy crashes into a severe deflationary depression. The world starves for necessary liquidity. But if they keep carelessly printing infinite dollars, their own domestic currency eventually becomes fundamentally worthless due to endless compounding monetary dilution. The United States was completely trapped. Can you see how this entire system is designed to inevitably collapse under its own heavy, contradictory weight? He was absolutely, undeniably right about the future. The physical gold drain accelerated rapidly. By the late 1960s, the French government literally sent a military warship to New York to aggressively demand their physical gold back in exchange for depreciating paper. The United States was bleeding its real assets. What do you actually do when your national bank account is suddenly exposed as completely empty? On August 15, 1971, the massive bill finally came due. President Richard Nixon panicked under immense political pressure. He went on national television and completely severed the historical, legal link between the dollar and the global physical gold supply. This pivotal event became known as the Nixon shock. Do you realize how fragile your personal financial foundation truly became on that specific, fateful day? Overnight, the United States dollar tragically became a pure fiat currency. The physical backing vanished completely forever. A fiat currency is simply money that is backed by absolutely nothing except the violent authority and the arbitrary future promise of the exact government that actively issues it. The physical gold constraint was permanently, intentionally removed. Have you ever seriously considered who actually pays the hidden, compounding price for this endless institutional money printing? Most regular people incorrectly assumed this was a temporary, desperate emergency measure. It was a permanent paradigm shift. The United States no longer had to balance its national checkbook, allowing it to easily print more money to pay for its debts, while forcefully exporting its domestic inflation to the rest of the world. The entire world absorbed the resulting economic pain. Do you fully understand the massive, unfair geopolitical advantage this artificially created for the banking class? The French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing coined a very specific, resentful term for this dynamic. He called it America's exorbitant privilege. Because the world desperately needs dollars to buy raw materials, trade industrial goods, and pay international debts, the United States gets to create infinite money without immediately suffering the hyperinflationary consequences. It is the ultimate global financial cheat code. But what exactly happens when the rest of the world decides to finally stop playing by your unfair, rigged rules? Cheat codes eventually corrupt the entire game. The dollar should have collapsed completely, but the financial system cleverly engineered a brilliant, highly manipulative pivot in the 1970s by striking a strategic, long-term geopolitical deal with Saudi Arabia and the major OPEC nations. This created the infamous petrodollar system. Do you understand what this secretive, exclusive agreement meant for artificial, enforced global currency demand? OPEC agreed to price all of their global oil sales exclusively in American dollars. The United States provided heavy military protection because every single country on Earth needed essential energy to simply survive. Every single country on Earth was suddenly violently forced to hold billions of American dollars just to keep their factory lights on. The absolute demand for the dollar was miraculously resurrected. Have you ever wondered why American foreign policy is so obsessively, aggressively focused on distant energy-producing regions? The United States essentially replaced its depleted gold standard with a highly effective black gold standard. It was a masterpiece of geopolitical manipulation. Imagine you securely own a magic checkbook, where the funds are instantly created out of thin air, yet the local grocery store still happily gives you real, physical apples and fresh bread. Other countries must sweat to produce real, tangible value. Is it any wonder the United States easily runs massive, perpetual global trade deficits today without immediate collapse? When the United States wants real goods, it simply issues complex treasury bonds. It prints digital paper. The rest of the world willingly sends back physical cars, advanced electronics, and vital oil in direct exchange for those heavily diluted, meaningless, digital digits. This exorbitant privilege casually allows the American consumer to comfortably live far beyond their natural economic means. Did you ever logically realize that the painful death of American manufacturing was a direct, calculated requirement of this global reserve system? To maintain this global dollar dominance, the United States had to willingly sacrifice its own domestic working class. The vibrant factories were deliberately hollowed out. They were shipped overseas to maintain the massive, necessary flow of dollars into the rapidly expanding global economy to forcefully keep the Triffin dilemma at bay. The financial elite profited massively from this brutal shift. What happens to your personal wallet when this complex, delicate economic machine finally breaks apart into pieces? Let us strictly reconstruct your exact financial reality if the dollar suddenly loses its absolute global crown today. Imagine a random Tuesday morning. A powerful coalition of emerging nations permanently announces a new alternative settlement currency, and global oil is suddenly no longer predominantly priced in American dollars. Nations immediately begin rapidly dumping their massive reserves of United States Treasury bonds onto the open market. How would you physically survive if your basic cost of living tripled overnight without any warning? The artificial, enforced global demand for your paper dollars violently vanishes. Millions of global institutions violently pivot away. They send their massive reserves of American dollars rushing aggressively back into the domestic United States economy simultaneously, exploding the total internal money supply in a matter of days. The actual production of domestic goods remains exactly the same. Do you clearly understand how brutal the unforgiving economic laws of supply and demand truly are? The purchasing power of your carefully saved money evaporates in real time. Imported electronics, basic clothing, and agricultural fertilizer immediately double in price. The central bank desperately hikes domestic interest rates to 15 or 20% to artificially convince panicked people to voluntarily continue holding onto the rapidly collapsing dollar. The stock market plunges aggressively as crushing borrowing costs choke corporate profits. Are you truly financially prepared for a sudden, catastrophic loss of institutional public trust? Most people falsely think a weaker dollar just means slightly more expensive summer vacations to Europe. The brutal reality is much darker. If the world stops eagerly absorbing American debt, the United States government can no longer borrow cheap money, causing the interest rates on your personal mortgage and your credit card to skyrocket to unlivable levels. Your comfortable high-yield savings account is actually violently losing you real purchasing power in this hyperinflationary scenario. Why do you blindly continue to trade your finite human time for a currency that is actively, intentionally melting? The government would be mathematically forced to print trillions more just to pay the compounding interest on its own astronomical national debt. This creates a severe hyperinflationary death spiral. The very financial institutions that falsely promise to protect your precious purchasing power immediately become the primary, ruthless engines of your ultimate wealth destruction. Your retirement savings are severely diluted by the exact second. Look closely at your current, everyday financial spending habits. Right now, you actively borrow money to buy a shiny new car that aggressively depreciates in value the moment you drive it away. You comfortably hold liquid cash in a traditional bank account. It passively pays you a pathetic 4% interest while the real, unmanipulated cost of modern living rapidly rises by an unseen, devastating 8%. You are blindly playing a competitive financial game with invisible, rigged rules. Do you realize you are behaving exactly how the banking system desperately needs you to faithfully behave? The institutions easily manipulate your predictable consumer behavior by carefully hiding the true, staggering cost of their endless monetary expansion. They want you completely financially blind. They want you to falsely believe that rising retail prices are just a natural, unavoidable force of nature or isolated corporate greed, rather than the mathematical reality of a systematically failing fiat currency. They do not want you to fundamentally understand the Triffin dilemma or the historic Nixon shock. Will you actually be the one left hopelessly holding the empty bag when the economic music finally stops? If you truly understood the concept of exorbitant privilege, you would urgently stop holding their melting paper. You would start heavily acquiring hard, scarce assets. Real, generational wealth is quietly built by logically recognizing the massive systemic illusion before the rest of the distracted, sleeping crowd does. You go to the grocery store to happily buy a simple dozen eggs. Will you recognize it as a front row seat to the slow collapse of the greatest financial illusion in human history?